Eleanor Whitcomb had buried her mother on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she already understood that the grief of losing her was about to become the smallest part of what she was facing. The will reading took place in a small stereo conference room downtown, and Eleanor sat beside her two siblings, respecting the modest, even split their mother had promised them for years. Instead, the attorney read a document that left every word she'd ever heard her mother say feel like it had evaporated into nothing. Everything, the house, the savings, the small collection of jewelry that had belonged to 3 generations of women in their family, all of it, according to the document in the attorney's hands, now belonged to one person, Eleanor's youngest brother, Daniel. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly beneath her. Daniel was 44 years old, and anyone who had spent more than an afternoon around him understood exactly what kind of man he was. Charming when he needed something. Persuasive in a way that left people agreeing to things they didn't fully understand until much later. Their mother had spent her final 2 years increasingly isolated. Her visits with Eleanor and their other sibling growing shorter and rarer, always with some excuse from Daniel about their mother needing rest, needing quiet, needing space. Eleanor had noticed the pattern. She just hadn't understood until that conference room exactly how far it had gone. She remembered with sudden and aching clarity conversation with her mother 18 months earlier, sitting at the kitchen table, her mother insisting, almost emphatically, that everything would be split evenly between her 3 children, the way it always had been in every version of her will, going back 15 years. Eleanor had no reason to doubt it then. She had every reason to doubt the document the attorney had just read aloud, dated only 7 months before her mother's death, signed during the very period when Daniel had quietly taken over every aspect of their mother's care and every visit she was allowed to receive. Eleanor asked the attorney, as calmly as she could manage, whether the will could be challenged. The attorney's answer was careful, measured, and entirely unhelpful. He explained that contesting a will required clear evidence of undue influence or fraud, that such cases were notoriously difficult and expensive to pursue, and that without something concrete, she would likely spend a great deal of money only to watch the original document stand exactly as written. Eleanor left that office with her hands shaking, not from sadness anymore, but from something far more determined. She had no proof yet. She had only a feeling, sharp and certain, that the mother she had known would never have done this. And she had absolutely no idea, walking out of that building, just how right that feeling was about to turn out to be. The family attorney Eleanor had known for years, a longtime friend named Walter Briggs, listened to the entire story over coffee 2 days later, and his face grew increasingly grave as she spoke. When she finally asked him directly whether he would help her fight the will, his answer landed harder than she expected. He told her gently but firmly that he believed her instincts were probably correct, but that fighting a signed and notarized will without hard evidence was an expensive uphill battle that could easily cost more than the inheritance itself. He told her she couldn't win this, not without proof no one currently had. Eleanor sat with that conversation for 3 sleepless nights. She thought about her mother's handwriting, shaky in her final years, but still unmistakably hers. She thought about how rushed and strange that final visit with Daniel present had felt. The one time she'd been allowed to see her mother in the months before she passed. Her mother seeming distant, almost scripted, repeating phrases that didn't sound like her own words. On the 4th day, Eleanor made a decision that frightened her. She withdrew $10,000 from a retirement account she had spent decades building. Money she could not easily replace, and she used it to hire a private investigator with a reputation for handling exactly this kind of family dispute. She told her siblings what she had done, and her sister cried on the phone, half from gratitude and half from fear that Eleanor was about to lose everything chasing a ghost. An investigator, a methodical woman named Patricia Cole, started where every good investigation starts, with the paper trail. She requested copies of every version of the mother's will, going back over a decade, being records from the final 2 years of her life and the notarization, documents attached to the contested will itself. Within the first 2 weeks, she found something that made her call Eleanor directly instead of waiting for their scheduled update. There was a problem with the notarization. The notary listed on the final will worked out of an office less than a mile from Daniel's home, nowhere near the assisted living facility where Eleanor's mother had actually been living during her final year. Patricia told Eleanor it didn't prove anything yet, not on its own. But it was the kind of inconsistency, she said, that usually didn't exist by accident. Eleanor hung up the phone that evening with her heart pounding, caught somewhere between hope and dread. She had spent money she couldn't afford to lose, chasing a feeling she couldn't fully explain. And now, for the first time since that conference room, she had something real. Thread. One that Patricia promised to keep pulling, no matter where it led. Patricia. Cole worked the case the way she worked every case that actually mattered to her, slowly and without shortcuts. She tracked down the notary listed on the final will, a woman named Brenda Holt, who ran a small notarization service out of a strip mall office. When Patricia finally reached her by phone, Brenda's answers were hesitant, careful in a way that immediately raised flags. She didn't remember the signing clearly. She couldn't recall whether the elderly woman in question had been present in person, the way notarization law required, or whether the document had simply been brought to her already signed. Patricia pushed gently, and eventually Brenda admitted something that changed the entire shape of the case. She had notarized the document based on Daniel's assurance that his mother was waiting in the car outside, too frail to come in, and that he would bring the signature to her directly. Brenda had never actually seen the woman whose signature she was certifying. That alone was a serious procedural failure. But Patricia wanted more than a technical violation. She wanted proof of what had actually happened to the signature itself. She brought in a forensic document examiner, a quiet, precise man who spent 2 full weeks comparing the signature on the final will against more than a dozen authenticated samples of Eleanor's mother's handwriting, spanning her final 5 years of life, including bank documents, medical consent forms, and birthday cards. Eleanor had saved without ever imagining she would need them as evidence. The findings, when they came back, were unambiguous. The signature on the contested will showed inconsistencies in stroke pressure and letter formation that the examiner described as highly indicative of forgery, not the natural variation expected from an elderly hand, he noted. Specifically that the looping in her lowercase letters present consistently across every authentic sample was entirely absent on the will itself. Eleanor read the report, sitting alone in her car outside Patricia's office, her hands trembling so badly she had to set the papers down twice before she could finish. Her mother had not signed that will. Someone else had signed it for her, and there was now a professional, documented opinion proving it. But evidence alone wasn't a finished case. Patricia explained that they still needed to locate the original, authentic will. The one that predated Daniel's growing control over their mother's life. The one that Eleanor remembered from years of family conversations, but had never personally seen in writing. Without it, they had proof the final will was fraudulent, but no replacement to offer the court. And somewhere buried in a filing cabinet or a forgotten drawer, that original document was either still waiting to be found, or it had already been destroyed by someone who knew exactly what it would prove. The search for the original will consumed nearly 6 weeks. Patricia combed through records from the law firm that had drafted the mother's earlier estate documents, only to discover the firm had closed its doors years earlier, its files transferred to a storage facility that took considerable persistence to even locate. Eleanor, meanwhile, searched her mother's old house herself, room by room, drawer by drawer, increasingly convinced the document might be gone forever. It was Eleanor's sister who finally found it, tucked inside a fireproof lockbox in the back of a closet. that Daniel had apparently overlooked
when he'd quietly
moved their mother's most valuable belongings out of the house months before her death. Inside, dated nearly 4 years before the contested document, was a will splitting the estate evenly between all three children, signed in their mother's familiar, looping handwriting, notarized properly at an office near her original home, witnessed by two neighbors who, remarkably, were still alive and willing to testify. Eleanor called Patricia immediately, her voice breaking as she read the document aloud over the phone. Patricia, usually composed and measured, allowed herself a long exhale of relief. They finally had everything they needed. The forensic proof that the final will was forged. The notary's own admission that she had never seen the signer in person. And now, the authentic original, properly executed years earlier, ready to be restored. Eleanor's attorney filed the will contest within the week. Dashing the forensic report, Brenda Holtz signed the statement and the original document as exhibits. Daniel's response, when it came through his own attorney, was a flat denial, insistence that the final will reflected their mother's true wishes and that Eleanor's case was nothing more than a bitter, grieving daughter unable to accept being left out. The case was scheduled for a hearing 2 months later, and in the time leading up to it, Eleanor learned that Daniel had already begun spending portions of the estate, a fact that made the stakes feel even more urgent. She sat across from her attorney the night before the hearing, the evidence laid out neatly between them, and asked him plainly whether they had enough to win. He told her the truth. He believed they did, but forged signatures and family betrayal had a way of surprising everyone in a courtroom, and there was no such thing as a guaranteed outcome, not until a judge actually spoke the words out loud. The hearing lasted just under a full day, and by its final hour, the outcome had become difficult for anyone in the room to seriously doubt. The forensic document examiner testified clearly and confidently about the inconsistencies in the signature, walking the judge through enlarged images of the handwriting, side by side. Brenda Holt, visibly uncomfortable but determined to tell the truth, confirmed under oath that she had never actually witnessed. The mother signed the document, a direct violation of the basic legal requirement for notarization. And the two elderly neighbors who had witnessed the original will took the stand, frail but clear, confirming the document, the date, and the woman they remembered signing it with her own steady hand, years before Daniel had ever begun limiting her visits. The judge did not take long to rule. The final will, dated 7 months before the mother's death, was declared invalid. The product of fraud and a signature that the court found was not authentically hers. The original will, executed years earlier and properly witnessed, was reinstated. In full, the estate, including the house, the savings, and the family jewelry, would now be divided evenly among all three children, exactly as their mother had always intended. Eleanor's share came to $400,000. She paid back the $10,000 investigation cost immediately, along with a bonus for Patricia Cole that she insisted on giving, despite Patricia's protests that it wasn't necessary. The remainder she placed carefully into savings, money that felt less like an inheritance and more like vindication, finally made tangible. Daniel did not walk away from the courtroom unscathed. The judge's findings of forgery were referred to the district attorney's office, and within months, Daniel faced formal charges of fraud and forgery related to the falsified will. The case against him, built on the same forensic evidence that had restored his siblings' rightful inheritance, proved difficult for his attorney to counter. Eleanor's relationship with her sister and brother, the two who had stood beside her through 18 months of uncertainty and fear, grew closer than it had been in years, forged in the specific, unbreakable way that comes from fighting for the truth together and actually winning. Eleanor still thinks often about that first conference room, about how close she came to simply accepting what the lawyer had been read aloud, about the lawyer friend who told her she couldn't win. She did win. Not because the law was simple, and not because the path was easy, but because she trusted a feeling long enough to find the proof that made it undeniable.